thank you for joining us today, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening for you, wherever you're located. The marvels of this new kind of more virtual world. My name is Patrick Wheeler, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Digital Strategies here at Tuck. We're really excited about today's discussion with Harish Sarma, who is a T'11 and currently works as the Director of Global Strategic Partnerships for Americas and Oceania at ByteDance, which is a really interesting company. And you may know it as the parent company of TikTok, although they have a wide array of media properties, including Douyin and others all around the world. I think 150 different markets at this point, plus probably.
Easily.
Yeah. We're really excited to talk today about the media and social media space, about partnerships, about careers and career paths. Before we kick this off, I also want to turn to Krishna Desai to introduce herself. Krishna, would you like to introduce yourself briefly to the audience?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Harish, for being here. So I'm a T'21, so a second year, graduating in just a few short months. I have a background in a similar space. So I came from Snapchat, where I was doing sports content licensing deals. So very similar work to Harish, which is why I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. Prior to that, I was at Turner Sports, just continuing to build that media resume for myself. And after school, I'll be pursuing similar roles in the media and entertainment space, ideally in the partnership space, ideally with a title like Harish's one day. So we're so excited to have him here and get forward with the conversation.
Thanks, Krishna. And so, for briefly, so I'll let Harish introduce himself more thoroughly, but has a really interesting background over the last decade post-Tuck life. Started out on Wall Street with Morgan Stanley and the banking side. From there, moved over to the NBA, where he helped transform the organization through global partnerships and working on other digital distribution deals. And then all those experiences have led him to ByteDance, which is an incredibly common career path through those three stops on your career. But please, we're really excited to have you here, Harish, and looking forward to a really great conversation today.
Well, thank you, Patrick. I think the only piece I'd add to that kind of like a preamble is, everybody starts somewhere, and so I think for me, even before I got to Morgan Stanley and before I got to Tuck, I was an engineer in a different lifetime. It feels like I've kind of come full circle. I was trained to be basically I was a developer coming out of college, and then I actually got into technology consulting, which is kind of like the best of both worlds, right? Where you kind of get to do the technical stuff, and then you actually get to spend time working face-to-face with clients. That's actually how I fell in love with the idea of going and getting an MBA and doing more. So there's a bit of if you thought it was already pretty, discombobulated getting there, there's a few more pieces before that.
Fair enough. And I think that having that technical background is something that's increasingly important, regardless of where you're at, but certainly in the space that you've been in for the last few years and over the last, several years. So, that's something that increasingly we're seeing as a differentiator across careers. That's probably a really important point to make. So I want to start a little bit about with kind of your current kind of role, because I think it helps set that stage, and then we can kind of talk about partnerships as well in your career and other questions as they come up. For those that maybe are less familiar with ByteDance in particular and TikTok, how do you explain it to folks that maybe aren't kind of a younger generation that are the kind of heavy users, although that's expanding for sure? Yeah.
Do you mean TikTok specifically, or you're talking about the ByteDance suite?
Yeah, a little bit of both. So
yeah,
ByteDance being the kind of parent company of all these organizations, but then TikTok being the one that most have at least heard of or used.
Yeah, that's fair. So I think the best way I could describe it is if you think about it in kind of like a tiered structure, right? So everyone's familiar, most people are familiar with, especially this crowd, familiar with the Alphabet Google analogy or the Alphabet YouTube analogy. The broader, the broader perspectives of how these organizations are structured really come down to what's the best way for each of these sub platforms to kind of do their best, right? So how does each platform find their voice in the world or in their domain? And so TikTok effectively is the global ex-China product. And it happens to be a short video platform. That's what, that's kind of how it's been defined to this point. I think we know with any platform, this is all TBD, right? So as these things evolve, we'll turn into something else inevitably, which is kind of what happens. But similar to I mentioned Google before. The analogy is very similar. So YouTube has its own purpose. Google has its own purpose within the organization. You've got a host of other products that are underneath there. Suite, for example. We've got effectively the same thing. We've got a bunch of products. We've got our own Office product suite that that doesn't get as much press, which is fine. We use it internally, for example, and we have a music streaming service that is operational in a few markets, not in the U.S., but in a few other markets. So the point is just that if you think about it, it's different working teams that focus on a product, and then you've got a ByteDance level focus, which is kind of thinking about the corporate evolution of the org. So it's fairly complex, but not anything different than exists out there.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to kind of grasp that. I think one of the things that's been really interesting to watch in this country in particular is the rapid acceleration of TikTok's growth and in the market. If you look at social, there was this belief for a while that social was owned by Facebook, and in each of the large tech companies in the US own sort of their own lane. Can you talk about that, what that's like for you? I mean, that much growth is probably incredibly exhausting / exciting for someone working, on partnerships. Is it hard to keep up? Is it, how does that play out day to day for you or for the org?
Yeah, it's again, very good question. I think the short answer to that question is I don't know. It's a story that we're still shaping and being shaped by, right? So when we first broke out of our shell, so to speak, in the last 2 years, we were kind of branded as Vine 2.0. That was kind of the way it was perceived. I don't necessarily take umbrage with that either way. I think there's just that, I kind of look at it as like perceptions are what they are because there's usually something that predicates that. And then in other ways, it's also just a perception. And then moment in time, these things change quite a bit. So for example, there's still references I get today that YouTube is a cat video place, right? Obviously that's not the case, but that's the association. Snapchat had, this ephemeral side that was always associated with it. And so whether or not like that's true or not true, or whether they've evolved, people will still always have these associations. And so you have to just do your job. And that's actually, strangely enough, very much a partnerships function, which is changing the conversation and evolving the thinking of not just the consumer base, but actually the publisher base. Because publishers at the end of the day, they look at consumers for direction. And the consumers themselves have perceptions that are predicated on what the publishers are doing on those platforms. So it's a very interesting cycle. So I'm actually, I don't have a good answer, except that we are evolving the idea, right, of what TikTok is. And so, if you had asked me this exact question, let's just say a year and a half ago, you would have asked me, what are your thoughts on TikTok being a lip sync and dance app? You didn't ask me that question. So that's probably because like we've evolved so much in the last year and a half that you haven't asked me that question. And so that's sign that like we're making some progress.
I think so. One of the interesting things about TikTok that we've been paying attention in the center in particular is it's the way that it surfaces content for viewers is a little bit less focused on the social network aspect and more on the content. Can you talk a little bit about that? And, I would imagine that in some ways can make your job that much more interesting too. But can you talk a little bit about obviously not the details, but how that plays out and what that does for you as a fundamental difference from, say, Instagram or others? Yeah.
Yeah. It's very common. I think this is more of my perspective. This is more of a boardroom challenge, right? When you think about it, a lot of boardrooms struggle with figuring out what each company does in an ecosystem. And no company, frankly, wants to be thrown in with another group unless they have like an exceedingly high multiple that they're trading at, in which case, sure, throw me in with all the other data companies. But at the end of the day, fundamentally, everybody has a unique identity. Krishna was at Snap, so she knows what I'm talking about here. Snap doesn't want to be likened to as similar to Twitter, for example, or Twitch, because these are not the same companies. They're not even remotely the same companies. And so what we tend to do is we kind of paint with the broad brush strokes and kind of put them all in the same bucket and call them social or something else, right? And I think the challenge is that, you know, so we're not really social. Yes, we have some social features. There's an ability to message, you know, assuming you hit certain age thresholds. But beyond that, you're not building like a social community of people you know. It's not like your friends are showing up here. You could share common interests, and your friends could be there. In fact, I end up sending a lot of TikToks to friends of mine that are both within my network and outside my network too. And that's pretty common. But I think the idea that we are a social network is less true. But I think we are definitely a community, right? So it turns out there's a lot of individuals that like certain things, certain types of music, certain types of videos, certain types of content, whether that's sport, you aggregate around something else that maybe that's more speaks to you, like education. So this is another vertical that's really growing now and becoming. Financial literacy is growing in a tremendous way. But I think it's important that we find a way to kind of identify who we are in this ecosystem, and then we kind of lean in on those features. So it's less about, hey, am I a social media platform? Am I a video? I mean, I look at us as we are video first. And so we are more, I think we're closer to YouTube than we are to a traditional social media platform. But even that's kind of where the associations kind of fall away. And I don't really know if I have much more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really helpful, because I do worry that when the lack of nuance that we talk about these companies and the differences can be really reductionary and not helpful to the discussions and things. And certainly TikTok has had plenty of discussion around the company in the last, you know, year or so in particular. So I want to pivot, because I think this is really important to talk about partnerships, which is one of the core things that we kind of why we wanted to have this conversation. Can you help the audience understand, like, what is it like to work in partnerships? What are you doing? What types of things are you looking for? And how is, you know, that's probably the best place to start right there. Like, kind of help define what partnerships really means when we say that.
Yeah. Patrick, I don't know how to really sum up that answer, but I will try. I will probably do a pretty bad job, but I will try. So okay. I think the best way I look at it is kind of its moment in time. So think of partnerships as what you do in a partnerships construct really is directly tied to when you join that organization, what stage of evolution that organization is, and kind of where they're headed. Meaning, kind of what is the trajectory for a lot of these places. So partnerships is materially different at an early stage startup, materially different, and even a startup, like we still call ourselves a startup because we are. And a lot of people laugh when I say this, and they think I'm being cute, but I'm actually saying that in the context of maturity of the organization, maturity of the structure, right? So the ability to kind of like do something at scale. When you compare us to some of the others, we've only been around for 2.5 years, right? Facebook literally just launched in-stream advertising on their platform about 15 years later. So we're being tasked with kind of like proving out the models that have come before us, and our window to like do that is significantly shorter. But if you're coming in in a partnerships construct, I think the idea is basically, how do I add value to the ecosystem in a way that is so material that it actually has impacts that are both, you know, external facing and also internally galvanizing. It's really a two-way job. So you have to ensure that every stakeholder, or at least as many stakeholders as you can internally, are aligned with you and the vision for what this partnership is and how it unlocks value for each one of them, because they all have different goals. You know, the marketing team, you know, has a completely different set of like KPIs than your product team. And as much as, you know, everybody wants to sing and hold hands and kumbaya all the way through, the reality is that they're measured against very different goals. And your job as somebody who's in the partnerships construct is to somehow weave this like ridiculous web that connects benefits across the entire org. It's actually, to be honest, it's actually a pretty painful and potentially like a fool's errand if you really think about it, because who wants to sign up for this job of, it's hard enough to just get the marketing team to align and agree on what we need to do. But imagine having to do that across the org, and then and then make sure that everybody's on board. Because if they're not, and somebody else, there's a dissenting voice, it's likely that this thing will not necessarily hit the high notes that it needs to. So it's interesting. It's extremely rewarding when it works out, and it's extremely, it can be soul crushing if you let it be soul crushing. I think you just have to kind of be built a certain way to kind of appreciate that. So I think I didn't really answer your question, but I think what I was saying is that it's the same construct. It's just different things at different times. So if you're at, say, and I don't know, I've never been at Google, I've never been at the org, but I'm assuming that the partnerships construct at Google is just a much more different conversation because it's such a mature organization, but the opportunities to partner there are very different than the kind of things that we're talking about here at TikTok, for example.
Yeah, but what are, I saw this in the last few days, they're a very large partnership with the UFC. Can you share anything about that and what made that the right fit for TikTok at this point?
Yeah, that's a good point. And thank you for the shout out. UFC was I say like everything else, it's a labor of love, right? So you everyone sees the success and then assumes, oh man, this stuff is happening, just like that. The reality is, this conversation started, I'd say right around when the pandemic started. So it's almost taken a year to get here. And for a lot of people, they'll say, oh, well, that sounds acceptable, but it's not a year of like trading emails. It's a year of like deep negotiations on both sides with multiple stakeholders. Everybody wants to figure out the best way and what's the right channel to kind of unlock value for their respective organizations. So how do you do that? I think what's really interesting about UFC for us is that they're not new to TikTok. They've actually been on the platform even before. I think what's really interesting about this partnership is that we're leveling up the kind of engagement that they're going to kind of deliver on the platform because they were ready for this. We launched a live product literally coincidentally with the start of the pandemic, roughly around the beginning of the summer. And then as we got into the end of the year, we actually started to see more and more tentpole executions on the platform, some that were initiated by us. And then it just became more and more evident that, the complementary service to VOD is something that's immediate, right? So how do you build that moment with someone who's stuck at home, who doesn't have like these outlets, for example? And to be candid, I mean, using an analogy, we were all tired of bedroom concerts. Like, I don't think we needed another one. So what is that next thing? And I don't, we're not saying, and I'm not saying, by the way, that we've figured this out. I think our idea is to say, let's experiment together, UFC, TikTok, let's try things. Let's see what's going to work. And you need a partner that can actually do that. And not many partners out there that have the capability, the resourcing, and the willingness to do that. So that's what makes this really unique. We're going to try a bunch of things. If you're following them, if you're following us on TikTok, you'll start to see that stuff. It's starting with, the next set of fights that are coming up, and they're big tentpoles. 258 is what we launched with, but we'll see. We've got a few things coming up, and hopefully, if what I understand is true, that we've got some major tentpoles coming up with them too. Yeah,
I think it kind of makes me think back to what you said earlier about depending on where you are in the evolution, how differently, in that origin story of like, how people mostly were introduced to the platform was singing, lip syncing videos. Yeah. Can you talk about that evolution? Because it's happening really quickly. I think one of the thing that I find really interesting, but also quite frankly, challenging is how much that vision of what it is, what companies today are, is changing quickly. Does that free you up to think much more creatively about the types of partnerships and what does that process look like for you now compared to when you started thinking about this from an UFC perspective?
And if I could just add, Patrick, that's a great point. And for TikTok, and similar to Snap, the platform is changing. Features are changing. There could be a world very soon where the send button, that share button, becomes very prominent. Because the company's decided that shareability is an important priority. So it's important to think of that as product continues to be a moving target and you're still trying to build coalitions across the organization. So it'd be great to hear from a product perspective, how you're setting yourself.
Yeah, it's without giving too much away on this call and having this make it on the front pages. I think that the short answer to that is, we don't know what we don't know, right? And I think one of the challenges is that until you've actually seen like a use case play out on the platform, you don't really know what the consumer really wants. The beauty about our platform, at least I feel very strongly about this, is I was always convinced that creativity and kind of unleashing creativity on our platform was going to be the catalyst to actually learn more. So we've learned actually more from our consumers than the other way around. And we're not necessarily going into these things with like, reams of data, even though we do a lot of data-backed analysis that actually drives the decision-making. A lot of what we actually look at is, frankly, what are consumers responding to? Because one of the most interesting things that you'll notice is that a trend is a trend and it's a moment in time, but it actually happens to capture the zeitgeist for that period. So you can't predict that, right? I mean, you can try if you want to, but what if you could actually empower that? And then you didn't have to, you kind of like, freed yourself of this burden of like being the soothsayer, which we're not pretending that we are. I think at the same time, we're also getting smarter, right, at making those calculated bets. So candidly, and we will find out if this is true or not, UFC is exactly that, right? So it's an idea saying, I see signals in the following areas. I'm going to put these pieces together. And I'm going to say, this is the right thing. Now, we're going to find out how right or wrong we were, but I don't think we're going to be wildly off. I think the question is just on delta of like outcome. But then, we could be surprised. We could learn a lot about kind of the response to this. And then we have to kind of, we have to pivot. And Krishna, to your point, product is the critical piece here. And I think, we tend to automatically assume that, these these premium partnerships, these like kind of these things that capture the moment, they tend to drive the conversation, but it's actually the opposite. It's actually the product that's driving, the outcomes. One of the things that I find really interesting is that I get to actually participate in the product process, which I could not have imagined doing that in any other organization. So for me, it's particularly exciting, whether that's, as it pertains to things related to sales on the platform, as it pertains to the execution, like, so the stuff that I've talked about with UFC is going to include product elements, right? And that's going to be interesting to see how this stuff evolves. Are we going to be able to do that as we continue to scale the org and get bigger and bigger and have more complex product teams that have more complex, individuals and more complex partnerships that we bring in? I don't know, but I know that we're trying to do that. We're trying to, marry all these pieces together, and it's interesting.
Yeah. So you and I've had a little bit of conversation about this. What are those, like, you mentioned a lot of things in there, right? You mentioned, working with the product teams, you mentioned the analytics and data. What are some of the core foundational kind of skill sets that you think really enable you to be successful in your roles, working in partnerships and working at a company like TikTok, that maybe, especially for our current students on the line, but also the alumni that are looking to move in other directions, that you would say, hey, these are the skills like you really need to nail, you really need to understand the importance of these and staying on top of them? Yeah,
I think, rather than have like a general, give you a general answer, which is like, go and take, I don't know, a course and an analytics course or a data science course, which I'm sure a lot of your students are doing, and if they're not, they should be. I think my perspective is very much, I think you have to try to find a way. This is selfish from my perspective. Don't take the long circuitous path to get there that I took. There's a lot of people who got there much faster than I did. I'm a slow learner. This is what happens. Like I figure out what I'm doing as I go along, and then I realize, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. And I realize I'm getting closer. So I've gotten, I would say, objectively closer to the answer, right? For me, over time, if you can figure out what it is you really want to do at one of these companies, if you know with a good sense of do you want to work in marketing? Do you want to work in programming? Do you want to potentially be a product manager, right? Do you want to actually work on the dev side, but you have interest in in doing other things? If you're a lawyer and you're transitioning into the businesses, a lot of lawyers I know, all they want to do is work on deals. So then I always ask them, if all you ever do is want to work on deals, then how long do you think your 7-10 year career on the legal side of under the GC is going to help you before you transition over? Like, certain organizations are more, they're more welcoming of that. They actually want, more folks to kind of jump and cross over. I think you have to find an organization that thinks like you. So I think the first thing is, you don't have to have the answer, but if you have a directional sense that I want to be heading in this way, then that's already a good start. For me, it was knowing that I love content. I know this about myself. It doesn't matter what area of content I'm looking at. I'm obsessed with it. I'm extremely obsessed with sports, but I'm, I love content of all forms. So for me, it became very obvious that I didn't want to leave the media and entertainment vertical. And so I knew that was clear. I also, candidly, I tested the waters with a few other, and that was the beauty of being at Morgan Stanley and being in the pools, that I got to spend some time in the, power utilities group, and I got to spend time with natural resources. And I realized that I am not, that interested in 99% of the stuff that's going on, not because those industries are not interesting. It's just that it was not the right fit for me. So I think figuring out your sweet spot is critical. And then if you find a company that, is kind of to your liking, I think figuring out where in that org you want to be in is also critical, because that's going to help you, I think, start to focus on the skill set that you require there.
Mm-hmm.
I think speaking from the student perspective, I come with a strong POV, and I always encourage my classmates to develop that really strong POV. I came into school knowing that I wanted to do the same thing when I left. I came to be a bigger, better, stronger professional. But I, for my friends and my colleagues on the call, I'm just going to asterisk this response from Harish, because I think it's such an important part of partnerships and what's been able to, get me to get here. So for my team, asterisk.
Thinking about career paths is probably a good time to talk more about yours, because as we mentioned and alluded to in the intro, it doesn't on the surface seem like, oh, it's natural to go from Morgan Stanley to the MBA and then over to TikTok. That's a common kind of path. Can you talk a little bit about what that path has been like for you, and sort of how those actually do make a lot of sense?
Yeah, I think for me, the most important thing has been, to just figure out the moments where you need to be real with yourself. This is just my perspective. I think you and I, Patrick, when we first connected, I think I mentioned to you that there's so much pressure on students going and getting their MBAs, not just at Talk Anywhere. And the pressure, especially now with like a year of a pandemic that we've seen, everybody has been largely remote, and they're having to build connections on Zoom with people that they probably would have like maybe met over a coffee. And, everybody knows why you're reaching out. Everybody knows that this is like a process of like building connections. So how do you not get caught up in this idea that this next move is going to be the move that's going to define my entire career, right? Which is crazy. Now, I never thought I would be 10 years out having this conversation, but I am, right? And so the reality is that I was in Krishna's shoes. I was in the same shoes as, the vast majority of people. And frankly, I just kind of looked at it as like, this is my opportunity to learn some really, really cool skills and to really, really pick up good work ethic and then a good work rhythm, which is what are the things I need to do that successful people kind of bring into their norms. So you mentioned, right? So what are some of the things you need for partnerships? I think in general, these are the lessons you pick up at whatever this next job is or whatever this next opportunity is, are really hopefully going to kind of set you off on your path. I never went into banking saying, this is the thing, I want to become an MD or whatever it is, right? So there's some people who have that. I, Krishna, this is the difference, right? Like I didn't have any of that. I have no airs about like assuming that I had the visibility to think about myself in that perspective. But at the same time, I knew I was deeply ambitious. And I think that's the one thing that everybody that probably is in the class right now and frankly has graduated feels like they connect with. So your ambition does not have to necessarily meet with the next job you take. It just means that the next job you take is a stepping stone to potentially the next three things that you do. And you don't write the plan, but for me, it's going to banking kind of opened up my eyes to the world of not just investment banking and finance and the liquidity markets and all things to do with equity and debt and learning about how businesses were actually valued, and then really starting to understand like how CEOs make decisions, how CFOs make decisions, and how so many people on the actual operating side of the house don't actually have an idea what's going on, you're right, on this side of the house. So I think I said that was fantastic. And then I said, what I really want to do now is I want to go and become an operator. I want to learn the business, because my number one frustration was I was building models and I was like presenting to boards with having no idea about what these businesses do. All you had to do was tweak a few assumptions. Next thing you know, this company is growing at 18%. Based on what? You've never actually gone and delivered a sale. So you have no idea what a dollar's worth of sales revenue is until you've done it. This was kind of like the internal monologue that I was kind of going through. And so I basically said, until you've eaten the dog food, as some people say, you have to go in and you have to prove yourself. So I decided I was going to go, and frankly, it took quite some acceptance on my part, which is that I had to take like a significant, cut to my not just my level, but also on the compensation side, which is again a very difficult conversation for a lot of people. They don't really want to do that because they're now accustomed to a certain standard. And when you come out of banking, it's only going to go up. It's not going to go down, and that's part of the allure. So I think you have to just kind of decide, like, this is the path I want to take, and it's going to eventually course correct for me. And if it doesn't, I'm still making a trade-off for the quality of the job that I'm going to have, and I'm excited I'm going to be about my work. So for me, that trade-off was the NBA. Couldn't think of a better place to learn the business, not just of sports, but of media, of content, of an IP owner, right? Disney is another place that I think falls in the same bucket for me. So, that's where I kind of, said, okay, I'm going to hitch my wagon here. I'm going to learn as much as I can. I'm going to have to eat a lot of humble pie because I came from Morgan Stanley, but the values that I bring with me are going to have, yes, there's some value to it, but I'm probably going to leave a lot of it behind because, being fantastic at understanding how the equities desk works is completely irrelevant in the world of Morgan Stanley. That issues like, in the world of the NBA that issues, one or two, bonds every like 10 years through their teams. And so completely a different world, right? So my perspective was go in, learn the business, and then come out on the other side and see what you want to be. And that's actually, frankly, it was very natural for me. I came in, I learned the business. I took a lot of time learning the business. And then I went from actually focusing on trying to bring value. So like valuation was a big piece of what I came to focus on. And while I worked on it, and while I spent a lot of time honing what I thought was the right rubric for how we, attribute value in every one of our deals, I learned that like the parts of the business that I wasn't impacting, like not just the sales side, but the actual business development pipeline was completely missing. So you could spend all this time, perfecting your rubric for success and ROI, but if you don't actually have, a seat at the front of the table so that you're actually understanding what the discussion is, then how can you negotiate the components that will actually feed into your model down the line? It doesn't make any sense. Now, that is a difficult conversation in a place like the NBA where everyone has their job and everyone has their lanes. So I was very fortunate, right? I got the opportunity to kind of try this while I kept my job. And that's actually how I transitioned. Again, not typical. And it was not easy because part of it was kind of like, well, this is not something you do. You don't have this background. This is not your experience. And I said, fair enough, but I want to do this. I'm passionate about it. Let me do this. Let me prove that I can do this. And if I can't, then we both agree that this didn't work out for a lot of reasons. I'm really, really happy that it worked out because honestly, I would have never then, picked up learned that I have this passion for this area. I would have never met ByteDance because that's actually how I met my future employer. I think they just got really, really annoyed and tired of negotiating with me. So they just decided to bring me over. That's my theory. And so that's why I'm here now. And that's why, for me, it's like, started in sports and then I've wanted to like expand. And so now for me, it's fantastic. It's probably almost too much, frankly, but it's exciting at the same time.
I think we forget as MBA students and, hopefully newly graduated in just a few months, that pressure valve is actually self-imposed. So we could release that off ourselves a little bit. And, in some ways the pandemic will, has helped but hurt us. And as we enter this period of major transition of digital transformation for a lot of businesses that didn't really have to think about it for a long time, I think it's an opportunity for us outside of the partnership space, within the partnership space, to think really deeply about how that rubric for success is going to change. And how do we continue to prepare ourselves for change? And I think adaptability is one of the things that stands out for me as I continue to navigate, coming back to sports as it's going through its own transformation period. So I'm going to continue to like release that valve for myself, but that's helpful. Seeing your path, continuing to enjoy what you do, and continue to prioritize bringing value and adding value to your own learning experience is hugely important for someone like me and my class to remember, I think. Yeah. So thanks for that. I'm going to move on to some more career path questions, if that's okay, Patrick.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Cool. Yeah, so you talked a lot about your transition from Morgan Stanley to TikTok, and then from your conversations with ByteDance and at the MBA and moving there. I've been in your shoes before where I'm negotiating with a partner and they're like, oh man, you know, Harish and Krishna, they drive a tough deal. It'd be great to have them on your side. I'd love to understand what excited you about the opportunity at ByteDance. It is a complicated organization. It can feel very unwieldy. We talked about your personal desire to learn and grow, but I would love to understand what about the organization was attractive at that time, about 2 years ago now, I'd say.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. About 2 years ago. So I've known the company for almost 3 years now because I started, obviously negotiating with them well before. So part of my journey with the company was actually learning, right, about this platform. And I distinctly remember this. We had an inbound from one of our colleagues in China. We have a really strong network at the NBA, and NBA China is just a machine in a very positive way. And so, one of the most interesting things was that they said, hey, listen, we're having a rep from this really cool company coming to New York. We'd love you to meet with them. And I was very fortunate. My boss at the time messaged a couple of us in the morning. It was like 8. So this is the other thing, is like, you never know when the moment will come. So just get ready for it. So it was 8:30 in the morning or something, or 8:15 or something. And he messaged us and said, hey, random inbound, I'm meeting with this company, rep from this company. If you like, are you free to join? So it was like me, and one other colleague as well. And I guess I was quick. I mean, I saw it and I said, oh yeah, sure. I'll be ready. I'll be ready for this meeting. So I immediately got on, figured out what the hell is ByteDance. I didn't even know what this company was since in 2017. And I started Googling them, and the things I learned about Toutiao, the things I was just like, where have I been? Have I been under a rock somewhere? I didn't realize the amount of time spent that, consumers are attributing to this app. The average news app, just to give you guys a sense, the average news app was at that time delivering about 6 minutes of engagement maximum. That is the top tier, premium in China, that is. And this app started off at 12, was starting to get to 32 minutes. And by the time we were about to have our conversation, was about to cross a minute worth of 60 minutes of engagement, daily engagement. And I was like, I'm not even on my social media apps for more than 4 minutes. So what is going on here? So I think for me, the light bulb that went off was there's a world out there that you're just not aware of, and just figure it out. Try to dive in, and don't assume everything. Assume you know nothing, which is what very clear from this conversation. So I ended up doing a bunch of research, and I went to this meeting, and it was thankfully had done some work, so I was able to ask some questions about what they were doing, and then that's how it started, right? I think that was kind of the train for me. And all I did was I just kept building on that initial, Krishna, to your point, that initial kind of opportunity was like, I want to learn more. I want to learn more. And to be honest, by the time it got to the place where we were negotiating, and I had a very strong affinity for the product. I absolutely love this product. I feel like you have to have some sort of connection to the product if you are going to make a move like that, right? I didn't have, I had a lot going for me at the NBA, so it was going to take something special. But for me, this was the kind of thing that was really, really exciting and interesting. I look at it as, if you think about it, as an opportunity for any creative, no matter who you are, to actually express yourself in a way that's that speaks to you. And so it didn't matter what the creative was or what that UGC creation was. There'd never been a platform for me that really was meant to be just go out there and be yourself. Now, I know that a lot of different platforms purport to doing that, but I saw this with India, where you had access to the villages, the parts of the country where effectively, and this is obviously a lot of the stuff that's happened more recently that are tied to the Indo-China political landscape, were out of our hands. So I can't speak to that, but I can say that in terms of the users, the engagement we saw from some of the people in the interior, the deep interior, most of these platforms, you would find, they're completely there's almost an access to just a very, very specific, not elite group, but a fairly elite group that has access to, the internet, has access to these materials, these tools and these apps that they wouldn't, that if you were to actually bring them to a market like India, you wouldn't expect that. I was seeing that content in my feed, which normally would get walled off and would never, you would never see that. You'd only see the stuff that's relevant to you, New Yorkers living in this world and this bubble, in my opinion. And for the first time, I was getting introduced to things outside of my bubble, and I loved it. I just said, this is fantastic. Couldn't this be an amazing thing if I saw a kid in a favela doing something amazing, and then that gets transported to Southeast Asia? This has never happened. I don't think we've ever had this. So for me, it's a very long answer and a very discombobulated answer, Krishna, but I think what I was trying to say was I was excited, and that was basically it.
Yeah, that's great. I think we're taking away definitely that your commitment to learning is part of the process for the rest of your time as you grow and navigate any changes in your career. So last question on this, and then we do want to talk a little bit about the algorithm. Patrick, myself, and all of us at the CDS are always talking about the TikTok algorithm and what makes it so interesting. But so last question on career paths and just what you do to maintain yourself. What are you doing to stay sharp outside of just this kind of personal commitment to growth?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I think I've taken on the last 90 days, much more personal, is like this commitment to personal health and well-being. So I've actually taken a pretty serious kind of like oath to not let the craziness of perpetual work from home and this idea that a 24-hour workday is more like a 64-hour workday, which is what it really is. But letting that kind of rule my entire schedule has been a negative. Has been a very big negative, not just at my time at ByteDance, but actually before that too. And so I'm reclaiming that piece. So I've now made a vow to do this, and I've actually been doing this now. It's now I was clocking it. It's like now 90 days of consistent workouts, which I'm not saying I haven't missed my days, but it is a big deal for me. For some, this is like the most normal thing in the world. For me, it's something that I haven't been able to build into my schedule with life and everything else that has happened. So that's a big part of it. So that's part of how I try to keep myself mentally sharp through being physically conditioned. I think that's something it's working for me, to be honest. It's actually giving me more energy. It's fantastic. That's one. The second thing is I'm starting to take a step back now. I'm hiring a more, I would say, more involved team. I felt I've invested a lot in growing the team and getting them to a place where they can kind of take the initiatives forward that I really want them to, with guidance. But I think my goal now is to start thinking bigger picture. And the only way I can do that is I have to think both inwardly and outwardly. I have to think about the ecosystem. I have to think about the overarching kind of shifts that are coming, whether that's climate change. What does that matter? Why does that matter for TikTok? I don't know if you guys saw the latest story, that the witness story that David Attenborough wrote, basically, and he basically put together which is kind of his witness statement for what's happening in the world. And the first thing that kind of like stood out for me is kind of, where does TikTok fit in this? Because to me, the question is not, oh, I'm a technology company and we produce videos where people lip sync and dance, but it's more, where are we headed? Are we going to actually be able to participate in this? And so I have a bunch of ideas. If any of them work out, I will make sure I mention them to you guys. And if none of them work out, I'll make sure I mention them to you guys too, because that's also part of this job.
Yeah. Recognizing the time too, I want to make sure we get a chance to have some of the audience questions kind of queued up here. But we could go for hours. I think, this conversation for me has been really, really exciting and a cool part of what I get to do here with the center. So some questions coming in. There's a question from Emma Sapad. Emma is one of our fellows with the center in T'21. She's asking about the music front because she wants to hear a little bit more about their licensing deals and sort of how important that is to TikTok. She notes that to her, it seems like the ability to tie music together with the video is almost underrated part of what differentiates TikTok and creates a pretty big barrier for rivals. So would you, if you care to talk a little bit about the music aspect of what makes TikTok so special?
100%. Yeah, I think, this is one of those, like, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater by talking about lip sync and dance and saying, like, let's not talk about music. Music is absolutely an endemic piece of what we are, right? So I think one of the best things that any platform can do is create major unlocks for the ecosystem, whatever that is, and change the way someone engages with that platform. And so for us, the big thing was to go out of our way to secure these through the label relationships that we have, which frankly speaking, if anybody has come from the music industry, they will understand this, probably some of the most onerous conversations you can get yourselves involved in. And it's not like we're the first organization that has ever like tried to have these conversations. We just went out of our way to make that be the goal. Now, frankly, some of this has some benefits that comes from our history, right? We purchased Musically about 3.5 years ago. Musically came with a lot of these relationships, I think like historically, but again, at a very small scale, right? The idea was to a very defined user base, you have access to the use of music for a UGC construct that is very, very nebulous, and let's see what Musically does with it. That was kind of the relationship that they had. To professionalize all those relationships and then to actually kind of take us to the next level, which is now a global access to a music library of things that are happening, not just now, but at any moment, and then more historically bring back things that could potentially, impact streaming revenue for every other platform out there. That's wild, right? So I don't disagree. I think it's actually one of the most amazing aspects of this platform is that video is great, but video and music is like on another level. It unlocks different things for us, even emotionally, I mean. And the music industry has actually evolved as a consequence of our involvement in this, which is crazy, whether that's Dreams, which is what, we saw that with the Ocean Spray, phenomenon. And everyone, you hear about Lil Nas X, but the idea being that more hits are being broken in the Billboard 100 than you have ever seen in the last 50 years that happened outside of a singular platform or a radio or a specific platform. Nothing has had such an impact as TikTok, which is crazy for somebody who, if you were an artist, you don't necessarily have to go anywhere. You can just do your thing on TikTok, and then if you hit the right chord, next thing you know, you're gonna be huge.
It is really interesting to watch just in the last year, driven partly by the pandemic and partly by adoption of new technologies. What you're noticing artists that are reaching communities at scales that just seemed completely out of possibility, the realm of possibility a year and a half ago. And I think Justin Bieber was on TikTok with 30 some odd million folks, live streaming. You mentioned Lil Nas X on, I think his concert on Roblox was like 60 million people in 3 days or something. It's been fascinating to watch, and then to your point, Twitch is now having to go back and try to re-engineer the music rights in, and it's been incredibly onerous and kind of hard for their creators to do that and things. So fascinating kind of question. I think a really dynamite question from Emma, who usually has pretty dynamite questions for us. Shifting gears a little bit, we received a question from Will Manis. Will's another T'21, one of our fellows here in the center. He asked a little bit about, the political and cultural challenges that arise from a global context. In your deal, focus on partnerships. Are these significant challenges? Are they just kind of part of the process? How do you work through those sort of challenges working more globally, and certainly given kind of what's happened in the last year and a half too? I would imagine that's harder than it was previously.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd say the vision for the company was always to be a global company that just happens to have an HQ in Beijing, right? Like that was the vision. And Yiming's perspective has always been that he's Chinese. He's not pretending to not be who he is. He's Chinese and he's very proud of it. And the idea is that just like you have companies that are based in Silicon Valley, in India, and other markets, why can't there be a successful company that has global appeal that sits in China? And to be honest, I think that vision is something I really resonated with. And part of it is that, we talk about pushing your boundaries and kind of focusing on areas where you may not be as comfortable, but more areas where you have blind spots. For me, I was super excited about getting into a company where I actually, there's two languages, and there's an opportunity to really push yourself to understand a culture. And I had spent some time in Asia, in my engineering days. I had done my tour of duty, so to speak, but I'd never worked at a company whose DNA was a certain way. And the difference was, I think there's different people will have a perspective on this, but there are more quote unquote Chinese companies that you could work for. And this was a company that felt, to me, was trying its best to be global and trying its best to actually have a global lens versus taking that lens. So to answer the question, I actually think that a lot of our partners see that, and they see that we are different because not only, yes, we have a Chinese ownership and that's our, our roots and that's who we are, but at the same time, that's not actually an impediment. It's actually part of what makes us unique and different, and that we're not like the rest. And so therefore, having a conversation with us is about thinking about what is that next evolution that we're going to bring. The other thing that we're bringing, which is frankly different, is that we're bringing innovation from the East to the West, which is something that we haven't seen en masse. And so, a lot of the things that you're starting to see now, which is social selling and, and some of the stuff that you've seen actually on TikTok already is all, has some of its roots in things that were already working. So I think that's also really interesting, right? For a lot of organizations, they've been told, hey, you need to appeal to an audience that's not the one that you are actually speaking to in the West, specifically the US and potentially in Europe. There's a whole big world out there in Southeast Asia and specifically in Africa. And guess what? If there's an organization that comes with that knowledge, that's us. And so how do we build the two together? I think our challenges are very different than your typical Silicon Valley company. But at the same time, I think the opportunity for us is also very different and exciting.
It's really interesting. And I think a couple of things that you pointed out, the center starting, I think in 2018, we started actually taking students on travel to China because of kind of the transformation that's happened to that economy and some of the innovation and the digital side, obviously not this year. But it is two things I think resonate with me. One, many of the companies we meet with are primarily focused on the Chinese market, even really large companies.
Yeah.
And we've had conversations directly with CEOs that say, I don't need to expand because I have a huge market here. And until I reach kind of start to bump up against that limit, I'm not worried about being a global company. And I do think ByteDance is different in that regard. I also think, to your point, so it does feel different. We are seeing a significant amount of innovation that, it used to be the narrative was the flow was from the west to the east. And
Yeah.
What we've seen in our travels has countered that extremely, so to the point where for some students, it's a little jarring at how fast things are kind of transforming. You mentioned social shopping, which I think TikTok, is sort of the entry point for that really heavily into the US. There was a live event with Walmart just I forget now, it was a little longer than a few weeks ago, but it was recently. What is that? How are you combating kind of like those perceptions? Do you have to combat those here as well with partners that, hey, we're bringing this innovation, or do they kind of get it right away?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to, who you're actually speaking with. I think historically, having some form of heft in the conversation, goes a long way. And the one thing that we have, thankfully, and hopefully we'll keep having, is relevance, right? So the vast majority of these partners, they may not necessarily even understand what you're doing. They may not, vast majority of them won't even, will actually admit to you they don't even understand TikTok, much less social selling. These are completely different concepts. And in many situations, they will actually misrepresent the opportunity because they themselves are not committed. Why should they? This is not their day job. This is not how they function as a business. But you see, what they will respond to is signals. And I think the big thing is that if the vast majority of consumers are saying, I want to spend my time here and I want to do more here and I don't want to do it here, they're going to care about that. And so there's a natural kind of like, this happens generationally, right? Whether you're Gen Z or Gen X or whatever, at the end of the day, you're sending out signals and you're basically saying, I'm voting with my time, I'm voting with my actions. And the consumer, thankfully, in many ways has said they like what we're doing for the most part, right? There's going to be things that we are going to have to tweak. But I think the idea is kind of like, how do we stay on top of that? Because as long as we are close to the consumer and we understand what the consumer wants, it actually doesn't matter, to be honest. I hate to say this, but it actually doesn't matter what anybody else cares about, because at the end of the day, that's where their focus is going to be. And that to me is kind of the crux of what makes this interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of space, and I'm glad we made able to talk about it today. One last question from the audience. Elise Sauvé. Elise is T'21, also a CDS fellow. Love the representation there from our folks. Elise is curious to see about sort of the impact that you see on the you mentioned the sort of the deep engagement and the large engagement levels that are continue to grow. She knows that the algorithm is great, but also addictive. Seems very, very addictive. How do you sort of ensure that you and your teams are having time to focus during the workday when you think about being able to engage on the platform itself, and sort of balancing that?
Yeah, it's almost like how do you stymie success is the question that I'm hearing, if I'm hearing it right. Most companies would wish they had this problem, right? That you've got consumers that can't put the product down. I think we've done a couple of things. We've actually put out we've actually built, like, within the product, an ability to actually identify these moments and to ask consumers to take a break, maybe go get a glass of water, maybe put the phone down. And it's interesting. Different consumers at different age groups, they respond very differently to these messages, right? Some people, they feel like it's an affront on my personal liberties. I get to do what I want to do. If I want to spend 4 hours doing this, like, I should get to do it. You shouldn't be telling me. And then we've got, frankly, some of the younger users, the Gen Zers of the world, that just flip. They just go to the next thing. They're like, yeah, great, thank you, appreciate it. I'm moving on with my day. So it actually, you realize at the end of the day, it comes down to personal choice. And as long as someone's not, like, participating in what I would term as harmful behavior, and I think addiction is the challenge there. It's like, where's the line, right? I think the question is, if they were going to go and do something else with their time that was productive, and we were keeping them away from that productive stuff, we should be thinking about how we actually maximize those productive outcomes potentially in the app. And so one of the things that, frankly, we are doing now, and it's a big focus for me, is thinking about education, but not in the traditional sense. It's in making things informative, making things interesting, and making things compelling, and having people kind of pick their paths. So if you want to, build on your financial literacy in a way that's actually, cultured and cultivated, we can help you do that. And so there's a bunch of ways we're exploring this one. It hasn't been an issue as much, to be candid. I think it's a perception thing. I think a lot of people are like, I may be addicted, and that's fair, but I think it's not actually real.
Yeah. The realities of COVID, to work from home, right? One last question, and before we go, and I appreciate that, and if you have to go, it's fine. As an education institution here at Tuck, we're always trying to learn. How do you envision TikTok playing a role in the future of education? Since you brought it up, like, where is this headed? Do you see, opportunities there for institutions, whether, in higher ed, for example, or younger, at engaging these technologies and helping to sort of change the way that they think about engaging with students?
Yeah, 100%. It's funny. I feel like there's a follow-up business development call that we have to schedule with Tuck School. It was on my list anyway. But yes, the short answer is yes. I think the challenge has been historically, speaking very freely here, I think the educational institutions across the board kind of have struggled with how they represent themselves on digital media. And I think this has been, I don't think I'm saying anything that's shocking or groundbreaking. I think the challenge is that, and this is why I kind of differentiated between education and information. I think the idea that Tuck is going to have a representation on a platform like TikTok is one thing, and I think it's unclear how that representation is going to be tied to engaging audiences, like, in a material way, right? So, like, how do we do that? I have no idea what's going on. I'll find out. Feels like someone's being attacked. But anyway, but at the end of the day, I think it's less about, hey, how do we get more educational institutions to get on TikTok, but actually, how do we build a program where consumers will naturally connect with the idea that they can not just learn from the Tuck School on TikTok, but they can actually start to build an affinity for the type of content that the Tuck School is able to produce for them and for their needs, versus doing like an oh no video, right? Which is going to sound exciting and interesting, but it's fleeting, right? So what's that value proposition? I think there's a much bigger question to be unlocked in education. It's the bigger, like, let's just say it's the $1 billion opportunity or the $1 billion idea that I'm excited about probably the most, is that how do you really get education on a platform that's available to the masses that actually kind of speaks to them, right? And how do you kind of up-level the conversation? Absolutely.
Well, I know we're over time. We can't thank you enough for a really fantastic and educational session today. So just thank you so much, Harish, from the school and from the Center for Digital Strategies here, from the Tuck School and Center for Digital Strategies, from all of our audience members, which are now spread quite a bit around the world. We just want to thank you for giving so much time and effort and educational content for everyone. So thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. I don't get to do this enough with the Tuck community. I miss the Tuck community. I miss being in the Upper Valley. It's been far too long, and frankly, this is more for me than it is for you guys. So thank you for allowing me into your lives today, and I appreciate it.
Well, once we're able to be more back in person and traveling again, we would love to have you up. So we'll hold you to that.
Fantastic. I've recorded that message, so you won't be able to take it back.
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Krishna for being a big part of this as well. And thank you to all the folks that submitted questions and listened in.
Thank you.
All right. Take
Thanks,
care.
Harish.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.